Welcome to the Steady On Stronger Together podcast. I am your host, Angie Bauman. Rachel Lewis writes and speaks on a difficult topic. She is a voice for pregnancy loss, infertility, foster care, and adoption. Building her family has been, as she says it, just a little bit complicated. But despite her struggle, Rachel has found a way to not only acknowledge her own grief and pain, but to walk alongside others in theirs as well. My husband and I lost a baby early second trimester in 2007, and I remember feeling so lost and alone then. My hope is that this conversation with Rachel can do two things. It can hopefully remind someone that they are not alone and encourage maybe someone else as they try to support a loved one in this grief. Let's listen in. Hello, Steady On community, and welcome to this Stronger Together conversation. I am Angie Bauman, and my guest today is Rachel Lewis. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Rachel is the author of the lewisnote.com. Is your blog called The Lewis Note?
Yes.
That's the name of your blog, The Lewis Note. And she is an author and a speaker and a voice for pregnancy loss, pregnancy infertility, foster care, adoption. The tagline of your blog, right, is when building a family is just a little bit complicated.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're going to talk today a lot about like miscarriage and some things around that are helpful and not helpful is kind of what we're going to talk about. But we're going to talk about all kinds of things, I think, that have to do with pregnancy loss. It's a difficult topic. And I think still, even though we have, you can probably tell me what is the month. I don't want to get it wrong. It's like pregnancy loss month, but we have that like in October, right? What is that actually? Yes. What's the name of it actually?
It's Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month.
Thank you.
That's October. And then the actual day of remembrance is October 15th.
October 15th. Okay. I didn't know that. So I've seen that more the last couple of years. I do think pregnancy loss and miscarriage is something that maybe we're talking about a little bit more. But I have had a miscarriage. I have many friends, that have had a miscarriage. And I do still feel like, and maybe you could speak with this before we even kind of get started, I do still feel like there's a lot that goes unsaid about it. Do you believe that's true?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've always thought it's ironic that in a world where we say we're so open about things and we're all women's rights and women's fertility and let's talk about things, we also still send the message, hey, don't tell anybody about your pregnancy until you're past the point where you are in the safe zone, which even that I feel like is this underlying message of if you go through a loss, go through it by yourself, go through it alone, don't tell anybody unless they're really, really close to you. And then you can maybe share a little bit. So interesting. And of course, we all know there is no safe zone as well. So
yes,
for sure. I feel like there is a lot of secrecy still.
Yeah.
And room for growth in this area.
Tell us a little bit about you and your ministry and even the book that's coming out maybe this summer, right? Can we just get a teaser on that even?
Yes. So my book launches August 10th. The name of it is Unexpecting Real Talk on Pregnancy Loss. And the way that this book came about is I was going through my second loss. I had heard, I was about 8 weeks gestationally and heard that from the nurse that my hormones were going down and I would be miscarrying. So I was not yet miscarrying, but I knew that it was imminent. It was coming. And so my husband and I went to Barnes and Noble like a couple of days after hearing, and I was trying to get things started. And I was like trying to find a book, like how do things start? What do I expect? How do I prepare? Because sometimes when you're losing, sometimes all you hear from the nurse, especially if it's, earlier in gestation, is just let us know if you're bleeding more than 1 pad an hour. And that's kind of all the instruction you get on how to miscarry. And I only found 2 books that day. The first was called, and I kid you not, titled How Not to Miscarry. And I was like, well, this is frustrating. And I'm kind of feeling a little bit ragey about this title right now.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And then
as if you've done something wrong.
Right.
Right.
Like,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
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 And then the other one was Taking Charge of Your Fertility. And I will say that is an excellent book, and has it's a book I highly recommend. But that did not help me understand what was going on and what I would be expecting. And I also felt a little sense of frustration again, because I was like, I've tried to take charge here and it didn't work. So I knew that there was a space for a book. And that was in 2012. Here we are in 2021. It's been a long time in the making and a lot of writing about pregnancy loss. And then also going through my own 5 losses back to back that really kind of helps inform this book. So it's basically I guess if I were to compare titles, it'd be kind of like a what to expect when you're no longer expecting, when you're unexpecting. Mm-hmm. And I call it Real Talk because I have a group of about 150 bereaved parents that contributed to the book, whose stories and little snippets of their information are in the book, because the idea is this is such a lonely experience. I didn't want people to feel alone. And I knew not everybody was going to kind of relate to my experience of 5 first trimester losses back to back. Some people are going to have a SIDS death and they're not going to relate to a first trimester miscarriage, or an ectopic pregnancy, or a stillbirth. There's so many various kinds of losses that a person could have. And so I knew that it was important to feature other voices and other experiences other than just my own. But then at the same time, to create a very welcoming, unifying kind of experience within the book where you can be like, okay, I feel safe here. Mm-hmm. I can belong here. I feel like I can unpack some of this experience and kind of understand my experience a little bit better and have more compassion for myself in the process. Mm-hmm. So the book is structured to cover loss, which is just the initial days and weeks, hours, days and weeks following your loss. And then lament. What does grief look like when you're really in the thick of it? Love, how do you create a community of support? How do you interact with others? How do you find the support that you need? And then legacy, what does this look like moving forward? How do you sort of incorporate this loss into your everyday life? Mm-hmm. Because this is not something that goes away. This is a forever part of your DNA. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what the book looks like. And I will be having a website that's going to be coming out as well. It's going to have a lot more additional information that I just didn't have room for in the book. So I'm hoping that both of these resources will really help a mother and a father understand each other, understand their own grief, as well as others who are trying to support somebody that is going through a loss.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful. I like what you said, that there was space for this kind of book. I totally agree with you on just the idea that the process can be very lonely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Especially Absolutely. When I do think the culture encourages us to grieve it alone. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So tell us just a little bit about your family. You're just a little bit complicated family, and your story, because I know the listeners are already curious about, okay, 5 losses is a lot, but you do have children. And so kind of take us through that just really a little bit, if you would, please.
Sure. So I would say that, just as I pictured my family growing up, I pictured, 4 kids, kind of equally spaced, 2 boys, 2 girls. The hardest part about having kids is going to be figuring out really cute names. I kind of envision this white house, which I actually do live in a white house with a picket fence, and I do have a fence and a dog, and I actually just got a dog. So certain parts of that
some of
story,
it, yes.
So our first pregnancy was unexpected. We were only 10 months into our marriage, and I had always known I wanted to adopt, and I assumed that I knew I'd want to have kids, but I just didn't know, I guess, between that and adoption, what that was going to look like. But at the time, I just wasn't ready emotionally to have a baby, and which really caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that reaction. And so it turns out that at about 8 weeks, I hemorrhaged, and I went home from the ER. They gave me a 50-50 chance of miscarrying, and she ended up holding on. And then at 36 weeks, I developed something called HELP syndrome, which is kind of goes along with preeclampsia, and it's a life-threatening condition. So I was at a lot of risks, and it kind of came to the point where the doctor said, C-section now, and we have a decent chance of saving you and baby, or C-section later today, and we might not have a good chance of saving either of you. And so that's like no choice, right? So thankfully, she did make it. It was a very scary process, but she and I both survived. So I kind of came from that experience again, like you, in the sense of thinking like, well, I've kind of survived that experience, so it shouldn't continue to impact me. But it did. I didn't realize that I had kind of developed a medical PTSD from that experience. And so that didn't, even get addressed for years. I just thought like something's wrong with me, because everybody just kept saying, well, your baby's okay, so everything's great, right? Like, you're fine.
Yes.
He was not fine.
Yes.
So so that was my first experience with pregnancy, and it obviously was not ideal. But my husband was like, I don't ever want to be in a situation again where I feel like I might have to face the choice of you or baby.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't, like, just what we went through was scary enough. I don't even want to face that. So we decided, okay, let's go ahead and start the foster care process. I knew eventually I wanted to adopt. Looking back now, I can say that I was a little like, I kind of wish that I had just gone into foster care just for foster care.
Okay.
Because I think that that's a healthier approach to foster care. However, we did start the process, and a couple weeks after getting licensed for foster care, I found out I was pregnant again. And this time I was like, okay, well, everything's going to be different. I'm going to be excited right away. And I was, and I'm going to start doing everything right away. And I did. And I was right. Everything was different. That pregnancy, the baby I named Olivia, was ectopic. She was implanted in my left fallopian tube. And we didn't know that at the time. I went through an experience where I thought I had miscarried. The nurses had told me earlier that day my HCG had gone up. So they were like, you need to stay close to a hospital. And so when, because we didn't know where she was, I just kind of assumed that I'd miscarried. And so I was on my way to my post-miscarriage appointment when my tube tore down the side. And so then, of course, that was another scary situation. Where I was rushed into emergency surgery. I was internally bleeding. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't know if I was even going to come out of anesthesia, because they said, we don't know what we're going to find when we open you up.
Yeah.
Like, we don't know how bad things are going to be. I didn't know if I was going to have both my tubes, or if I was going to get a hysterectomy. There was just no saying. So they were able to patch up my tube, thankfully, and obviously did not have a hysterectomy, because I did go on to have other losses. But that was a really horrific experience, because I thought that I understood, like, if you just prayed, if you just did all the things, that, God was going to come through for me, just like he did the first time that we almost miscarried at 8 weeks. But this time we were 7.5 weeks and we lost the baby. And I just sort of felt other everywhere. I felt like a stranger in my own body, in my own life. And I felt like I had significantly changed, and everyone around me just wanted me to immediately go back to just pre-pregnancy Rachel, who I was several weeks ago. And that just wasn't possible. And I think I recognized, I had almost lost my daughter, my eldest, at 8 weeks. And so I knew what it was like to be like, I would have missed out on this entire life. Like, all of these things that I know about her, I wouldn't have known if we'd miscarried her. And so I recognized, like, I'm not just missing 7.5 weeks with my
Right.
baby, I'm missing an entire lifetime
Yeah.
with the person that I was in love with,
Yes.
that I just was wholeheartedly committed to. And so that was a really challenging situation. So here we are, we're licensed for foster care. So on one hand, I'm balancing like foster care and adoption at the same time that we are now trying again. And kind of during that process, so over the course of about 5 years, I had recurrent miscarriage, which was, as I said, a total combined loss of 5 losses back to back. And that also qualified me for secondary infertility. And so, of course, we were seeing fertility specialists and rheumatologists and all these things, but it was unexplained. So no one could ever tell me why I was having trouble carrying a baby. And at the same time, we met our second daughter, and we fostered her, and we were able to adopt her, which is a beautiful thing.
Yay.
And we met our foster son, who came just a couple months after a couple months after our adoption. And we had him for a year and a half, and then we returned him to his biological family.
Okay.
And so that was a very, very deep grief.
Yes.
To go through
a different kind of trauma.
Experience.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Very much so.
Yes.
Different and yet the same. Like, I mean, it's hard to say because I know that he is not my child, but at the same time,
he is your child.
Mother.
Right. Absolutely.
So, it's a hard.
You can't tell your heart that, right?
Exactly. I mean, we talk about, you're a foster family. Okay, well, my heart doesn't differentiate between biological bonds and foster bonds and adoptive bonds. Like it just doesn't. So, so just a couple months after that, my husband was convinced me after 5 losses to try again. And I'm like, yeah, I actually pretty much am terrible at pregnancy. So like, maybe we shouldn't. And he's like, no, let's try, like, can we please just try one more time? So we did a couple months after our son left, and we got pregnant right away. And which was the first time really we'd just gotten pregnant right away when we were trying, and we were able to keep that pregnancy.
Wow.
It was a very hard pregnancy, but at the same time, it was a beautiful pregnancy, and I was able to have a VBAC after that, which was very, very healing in and of itself. I think that really actually helped heal some of that trauma from that emergency situation. And so actually her whole life has been kind of like a healing balm to me. And then when she was a year and a half old, our foster son that we had reunified came back and lived with us for another 2 years. And he just reunified again this summer. So I was like, I didn't know you could lose the same child twice. This is a lot of complicated feelings here. So probably
a lot of complicated feelings here. I don't like that, but I like that. I like the way it's a lot of complicated feelings. Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to pause right there because I think that's worth saying. Yeah.
It's definitely a complex situation. And I would say probably my least favorite question is, how many children do you have?
Yes. And how do you answer that?
It just depends on the day and the person as to how I answer. But it is the first time I encountered that after the loss of Olivia. I was like, I just said 1, but in my head I was like, but I was just pregnant, but I just had another baby. Like, did I offend her? Did I leave her out? Like, that's a really hard question to answer for most people, actually.
Yes. It really is. So. I agree. And I so agree with you about describing what that loss felt like, not the 7.5 weeks that you knew her, but the knowing of her because you already have a daughter and knowing what that, I remember the day that I found out that the baby I was carrying had died. And I went into my son's room, who was probably about 2.5 at the time, about 2. And I just watched him sleeping and cried and grieved because I'm like, it's this pregnancy that I've lost, but it's this that I've lost, right? This child that's here sleeping. And that child would have been different. Of course, I know that, but that was the representation of what that loss was to me, that this was my hope. This was my, I loved this baby like I love this one lying here sleeping. Right. Yeah. And I was surprised, quite honestly, of how deeply I felt that grief then. Yeah. And still can, obviously. I'm tearing up telling you that. And it's been a lot. That was 2007. So it's been a long time. Yeah. But yeah. So, I want to read off of your website. I think I pulled these things off your website. A couple of things you write about mixed messages. This was in one of your blog posts, I think. You probably, I don't need to tell you where it is, but I just tried to, but a few mixed messages, things that people say to people who have miscarried or have lost, things maybe people said to you. And I'm just going to kind of go through them. And then I really want to just ask you, like, your feelings around these kinds of statements and why you feel they minimize kind of the value that we're talking about of a miscarried child. So here are some of the ones that you write. And I might have paraphrased them a bit. So a miscarried baby should be gotten over quickly. You mentioned that already. A miscarried baby was probably damaged goods. A miscarried baby fulfilled God's plans. A miscarried baby is a slight bump on the road of life, or you'll have more, just relax. So talk to us a little bit about where those statements maybe come from, you think, from people who are, I think, often well-meaning. But how does that affect, how has it affected you? How do you know that it affects others who are dealing with this kind of loss and grief?
Well, like you said, I think they are well-meaning. I wrote in my book about 99% of things that people say to you are well-intentioned, and approximately 50% of them will hurt. And of course, that's not scientific by any means, but it's just true. Like, words can be incredibly painful, and that's hard for both the grieving, because of course we feel vulnerable to anything that somebody says. Could just be like a grief attack almost, something we have to deal with. It's a couple sentences or a couple of seconds worth of words that we might be wrestling with for days, weeks, months, or sometimes even years. And then it's hard for the people who are trying to comfort others because they don't know what to say. And that if they do say something, they're terrified of hurting. So they really just want to comfort, but it's just so hard because we don't have really great education. We don't have really great literacy around grief. So these kinds of sayings that I had shared in this blog post, those are what's called platitudes, which are basically just easy sayings, easy answers to very complicated questions. And in my experience, what they accomplish is that they make the person who is trying to comfort, so the comforter, it makes them feel better. And it typically leaves the bereaved feeling worse off than before. And there's a couple reasons for that. The first is that most of them are untrue, right? So I say, like, bad grief support feels bad because it is bad. So if I go through these, a miscarried baby should be gotten over quickly. Well, like you and I both have said, it's not just 7 weeks that you've lost, or 20 weeks, or 40 weeks that you've lost. It's an entire lifetime with a person you love. Second, research doesn't say that. Research says that it depends on your relationship with that pregnancy. It depends on if trauma is involved. It depends on if infertility is involved. It depends on just how connected you feel to that baby. That's going to determine your reaction and your response and your grief. And so somebody really could react just be just as bereaved at a 4-week loss as they could a 40-week loss. So it's not as linear as we typically we try to make it seem. Like, well, if you're 20 weeks and you're only half invested in this pregnancy, it's not true.
Yeah.
So it's simply just not a true statement. A miscarried baby was probably damaged goods. First off, I think most of us, we would take our babies in whatever forms we could, right? We want our babies to live. And granted, some people will have to make really hard, horrible decisions, but that is not to say that they don't want their baby and would not want their baby to be whole. So typically speaking, we just want our babies, period. We don't care that if something was wrong with them, we just want to be with them, and we want to take care of them. And we want to mother them. Two, that's not just the reason why babies die.
Yeah.
There's so many reasons why babies die.
Mm-hmm.
My baby probably had nothing wrong with them. They just were implanted in my tube.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of cord accidents that could happen, or problems in labor, or like I had earlier, preeclampsia and HELLP syndrome easily could have taken my baby's life. And that has nothing to do with my or their babies not being healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So again, not true. A miscarried baby fulfilled God's plans. So this is spiritually a very hard thing to say. So what I often say is, not everything that happens to you in life is God's will.
Mm-hmm.
So as a foster parent, if I were to have a child come into my home who had been abused, I would never turn to them and say, your
This
abuse
was God's will for your life. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even if they came into my home, even if they went from a home of pain and suffering to a home of love, like,
right.
I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
That loss that they suffered, the millions of losses that they suffered in that incident, was not God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
God is a good God, and that is, he doesn't just like, oh, well, I'm going to interject this horrific, horrible thing that requires your baby to die.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, things happen all the time that God does not will. And why would Jesus tell us to pray for God's will to happen if it were guaranteed?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we know God's will doesn't happen on earth all the time. So that is a really, really far-reaching thing to assume, that God had willed their baby to die. Miscarried baby is a slight bump on the road of life. We've already talked about that one, why that's not right. And you'll have more just relax. Well, again, there's lots of complicating factors as to whether or not somebody can carry another pregnancy. And number two, subsequent pregnancy never replaces another pregnancy. People cannot replace people. I mean, if you had a mother and your mother died, I would never say to you, well, don't worry, your dad can always marry again. Right? Like,
yes.
No, it's a person, it's an individual. You have an individual relationship with that person. So one person never replaces another. There can be healing, and there can be a beautiful new bond and new relationship with another child.
Mm-hmm.
But that does not mean that the grief of the other child is just magically healed.
Right. Yeah. There are times both my husband and I say, I just wish we had all three of our kids. Right. And it doesn't, right. I mean, it doesn't mean that I don't have a unique relationship with both of my children and that I don't love them. I don't love them less or whatever, but sometimes I still just miss her because I wish I had them all. Like, I just, and that doesn't ever go away. I still think about, I guess I just want to say this, and maybe you can speak to it too, for those listening who have experienced this. I think about it on the day that I found out that I had lost her. I think about it around the time that she would have been born. Right. Like, I still think about that every year, and I think about how old she would be. And I don't think that I'm like stuck in this place of like the bad grief or anything, but to me, it's like, I don't know. I honor her that way. I honor the loss that way by remembering and just honestly, I just wish you were here. That's just the truth.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's this false idea of what it means to resolve your grief. And a lot of this actually started with Freud. It actually continued some with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. This idea of resolving your grief. And there was, I talk about this in my book, so I don't have all of the names in front of me of who did the research on this, but they basically realized there is a whole nother way that parents of dead babies actually consider their relationship with their babies. And they've come up with this grief theory basically called continuing bonds. And that means that your relationship, while different after death, after the death of your baby, it's not the same kind of relationship that you would have before, right? We're not putting our babies to bed, we're not rocking them or nursing them, but our relationship is no less real than it was before, and that we can and often do take different ways that we still parent our child. So for you, maybe that means you're thinking of your child on that day and you're saying, this is my baby's day and I'm going to remember her and honor her. Maybe that means you light candles. Maybe that means you have, you leave a chair empty at the dinner table, or you put a stocking out at Christmas. I mean, we all have different ways that we choose to incorporate our baby's lives. And for some, it might be more public, and for others, it might be more private. But it is a very valid, scientifically valid way of processing your grief after loss.
I hope that's encouraging. It's encouraging for me just to hear you affirm that. So I hope that that's encouraging for others, for us to affirm that today, for sure. So let's talk about what you call baby loss competition. Oh, I could so resonate with this when you were writing about this, because I know one of the things you said is when you began to go, and correct me if I'm wrong, like to a support group or a group of other people who had lost children, I think you began to compare yourself or your story, your loss with others, because maybe even like my loss isn't as great because I lost my baby at this many weeks, but she lost her baby at that many weeks, or her baby was born and then it passed away. And so what is this idea of baby loss competition and why is it harmful for us?
Okay. So, like you said, it started at a support group, and I can remember the moment that I kind of first experienced it. And I was at the support group. We were going around the circle, introducing ourselves, introducing our losses. And of course, that is a very, very emotional time for everyone to just have to be able to speak out loud to a group of strangers what happened. And so as a highly sensitive person, I also was just kind of absorbing their grief and their losses and just feeling the weight. And I was just so incredibly sad for everyone who had spoken it. And I was like second to last or something. And so after listening to, a SIDS death and all of these stillbirths, I felt frankly embarrassed, because here I was absolutely gutted and at the 7.5-week ectopic pregnancy. And, I struggled too, because I was like, on the one hand, I was a little jealous, like, oh, you actually got to meet your baby. You got to see what she looked like. You got to hold her hands or get her footprints. Like there were aspects of that I sort of wanted. And I think what I wanted was not only to have met my baby in some capacity, but also the validation that sometimes can come with a later loss. But like I said, I was just so embarrassed, and I just kept thinking these women are probably looking at me like, who is this girl that is so upset? And I mostly just judged myself for it. And one of the issues specifically with pregnancy loss is there's kind of two issues. One is that in many cases, it's kind of an ambiguous loss. Some of us do end up with babies who we can see and we can hold and we can get footprints of, and, we have to bury in a casket, or have their ashes. Like for some, it is a very tangible loss. And for other people, it is a very ambiguous loss. And, you're pregnant, and maybe you have an ultrasound, maybe you don't. But maybe, maybe you pass the baby in a toilet, or maybe, like there's all kinds of, like one of my miscarriages happened at a gas station. Like, there's this, it's not as reverent, I guess, as you kind of think that a loss should be.
Yeah.
And there's sort of this invalidation. And I think another part of it is, especially if the pregnancy is earlier, but it can happen, it can happen across all gestations, but other people have not yet interacted with your baby.
Yeah.
So you're kind of in this very lonely space because you have this relationship, but those around you don't have that kind of interaction with your baby. They're still waiting to say hello, let alone have to say goodbye.
Yeah.
And so you're just kind of lonely and in this kind of ambiguous, like, I know I lost something really significant, and I know that I lost a person. but everybody's just treating me like I just had a period. So there's that really just sort of that
like there's no
ambiguous
evidence
space.
that it was important almost.
Right.
Is that fair? Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's no evidence that it was important. It didn't cost any money. Well, maybe the miscarriage, but it didn't take up space. It didn't it didn't leave. I remember one of the things that somebody wrote to me after my miscarriage, and I've written this similar thing, is just to remember that this life, even though it was known by so few, had a significant impact on the ones who knew it. Like that was really important to me. And I try to share a similar sentiment when I know somebody's struggling through a miscarriage, because the life that is lost matters. Right. And that's, yeah.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. I cut you
Absolutely.
off. I apologize for that.
No,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's just that kind of highlights this idea that our grief is often disenfranchised. Like that's an actual term, disenfranchised grief. And it basically means that society at large, or it could be your society, your family relationships, don't validate your loss, don't validate the experience of your loss, or validate the value of what was lost. And so when we're talking about like kind of comparing our losses to others and kind of this pain Olympics of like who has it worse, who gets to grieve more, it's just extra complicated because we're looking at things like, we're dealing with ambiguous losses, and we're dealing with it in a stage of being disenfranchised. So all of it is, as we said, a lot of complicated feelings. So it's hard. That pregnancy loss competition is hard, but there is an answer in the sense that as I was working so hard to invalidate my loss, I actually, as a part of the support group, watched so many other women validate my loss. And that's something that has stuck with me.
Sure.
And that's something that we can give each other, that we take each other's grief exactly as it is and accept it for what it is. As opposed to trying to get somebody to feel less or feel more, and just take people as they are and validate that and kind of reflect that back to them and say, yeah, that's what you're feeling. That's where you're at. That's okay.
Yeah.
We're here for you, and we're going to support you no matter how you feel about it and no matter how long.
Yeah.
So there is this kind of hidden feeling that we can have, whether that's spoken or whether that's just something we feel inside of ourselves. But I think the more that we can talk about it, and the more we can accept each other, and the more we can be grief literate, the less that has to invalidate us and affect our own grief processes.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when you were saying that, it reminded me of something that happened to me. I had miscarried just a couple of days. I actually had a surgery after my miscarriage. And so I didn't have like a long recovery. But I had been home for a couple of days, whatever. And I had gone out to like a department store, just like somebody was with my child and like, go do something for yourself, was kind of like the instruction I had. And I was at like a Macy's department store. And I was standing in line. There was a few people in line at the counter, and something went wrong with the purchase, or it wasn't the price I thought. It was no big deal, but I began to cry. And I just, just was crying. And I just like, in a moment of vulnerability, I just kind of looked around because people were looking at me like, who's the crazy lady? And I'm like, I just had a miscarriage. And this like, and I'm sorry. Like, I was just like, I'm sorry. I was just trying to like, justify or something my response, and there was just this like awkward silence of all the people that were kind of standing around. It wasn't like hundreds. It was like, 4 or 5 or whatever. And the cashiers and all that. And the cashier, she looked at me very gently and redid the thing, and it went fine the next time or whatever. But I walked away from that experience, like, one, feeling like I shouldn't have opened my big mouth. It's no big deal. They didn't know what to say, but it was just that awkwardness, but I couldn't, like, it had to go somewhere. Like, it wasn't the shirt I was buying or something, but it was just like, when that went wrong, it just like broke something in me. And I just like, I kind of want to be, and I want this conversation to be, but I want to be like someone that can say something in that moment, right? Like, just walk around the counter and put your arm around that girl who's just struggling with what she's just experienced.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like, something is better than nothing.
Right.
A lot of people say silence is the worst thing.
And it was probably unfair, I guess, in some ways to do that, but it's just where I was, and I couldn't help it. Like, I just couldn't help it. Yeah.
And honestly, I think the onus needs to be on the supporters to support better and not on grievers to grieve better.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. We're grieving the best we can, some of us, right?
Yeah. We're doing, you're doing the absolute best you
Yeah.
can in the worst situation ever. Right?
Yeah. So one of the things that you say, and I admire this about you, is that those who read your writing or listen to you don't expect easy answers. What do you mean by that? And why do you think that's important to share?
Well, as we talked about platitudes, I think that easy answers shut someone down. It creates this space where it kind of puts the griever on defense a little bit as to why
I can imagine like almost this physical space, like when you have a platitude or when you say something like that, it's almost like you're trying to create a barrier between you and the grief. Is that true? Like your grief is too messy for me almost. And so just keep it a little farther away. I don't know. Is that fair?
I do think it's fair. I think that, like I said, I think it's a comfort to the person. And here's sort of how I kind of break this down a little bit in my book. But how I kind of see it operating is I'm uncomfortable with your grief. And I feel vulnerable because you went through this loss, which actually means, let's say somebody's baby died for no reason at all. If your baby died for no reason, that means also that my child could die for no reason at all.
Yeah.
And that makes me really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I need some kind of answer. Like you said, some kind of, I need to wrap this up in a story that sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm going to say, I'm sure God had a reason.
Yeah.
Because if God had a reason your baby died, then I don't have to feel so vulnerable.
Right.
I don't have to worry so much. And if God has a reason, that should give you some comfort. And sort of kind of like, well, if I can't fix your grief here, let me just try to fix you a little bit. Right.
Yes.
If I can't fix the problem, let me just try to fix you up a little bit. And maybe, maybe it's trying to fix your faith, make you feel like God has this. It could look lots of different ways, but I think it comes from a place of us not wanting to embrace our own vulnerability when we support other people in their grief. It is kind of that barrier. And I think it's a barrier that we put even around ourselves when we are supporting somebody else to say, I still want to feel safe. And I don't feel safe if I let your grief in. So I think it's kind of a protective mechanism. So when it comes to my writing, or my book or my support group and Brave Mamas, I try really hard to steer clear of those kinds of easy answers. For the most part, those of us who have easy answers, it doesn't cost us anything. Right? So for the person who's grieving, they are probably going to be wrestling with some really, really huge questions that cost everything to them. And if I just come at them with an answer that costs me nothing, it doesn't cost me anything to say, oh, well, God, your baby's in heaven now. They're in a much better place. Yeah. That doesn't cost me anything. Yeah. But man, does that really just shut them down. And it costs them everything. Right. And so I think everybody has every right to wrestle for as long as they need to, even if that's for the rest of their lives. And we don't get to be the people as grief supporters to say, this is why, or this is how, or you need to do this, or this is the answer. That to me is a way to shut people down. There's this idea in my book that I use called holding space. And it's not an idea that's new to me. It doesn't originate with me. But it's this idea that I am going to create the space that you need. I'm going to hold it for as long as you need. So where you can wrestle and just be who you are, where you are, as you are. And I'm going to be okay with that. And God even kind of has an example of this in nature. So you may have heard this analogy of like what elephants do. Have you heard? I don't know if you've heard this. No. So elephants, when a mom has a baby, they recognize that mom and that baby are in their most vulnerable state, and most easily, like, predators can easily get the mom because she's so weakened by labor and the baby. And so what they do is they circle around her and they put their tails in, and their shoulders out and their ears extended, so they literally create a circle
My goodness.
around the mom and the baby as they are recovering from this experience. And I see that as like physically holding space for people in their most vulnerable moments. And that's what I hope my book and my words and my writing does, is it just holds that space, intention, and says, I'm going to do the best that I can, from where I'm at, and to encourage other people the same. Like, even just us as a tribe of bereaved parents, to say, you are vulnerable right now.
Yeah.
We want to do everything that we can to just create the space that you need to heal in your own way.
Yeah. I love that. That's beautiful. What a beautiful picture. Yeah. Just a beautiful picture of what we can do for each other. So kind of as we wrap up, just take just a second, if you will, in a way that I know you can do this well. For those who may be listening to this today, and it's really been hard to listen to both of us to share loss stories, and to listen to you talk about some of the things that people have said that have not been helpful, maybe in their own journey, or even those who are listening that do know people who are going through this or will. Would you just take a few moments and just encourage them?
Yes. Well, yes, I know you had asked, like, what about people who are feeling alone?
Yeah.
And I want to really just encourage you to know that, like, you're not alone in feeling alone.
Mm.
Going through this experience when you don't have those memories to share with other people, and it's such a hard loss, and it's even hard for us to talk about, and we're not good as a society about talking about it. Like, there's a reason you feel alone in it, right? Like, that's just not on you. That's on us.
Mm-hmm.
As society, that's on us, as a system, that you feel alone in this. So that's not in any way, shape, or form like you're not doing the right thing.
Wow.
What I would encourage you to do is, and I talk about this a little bit, I expound on this in my book, but it is absolutely vital that you have support. And there's 3 kind of ways that you can get support. You can have self-support. That's going to look like self-care. That's going to look like, taking care of your body, making sure that you get rest, that kind of support. So you've got some self-support. There's going to be professional support. So people who are therapists, allowing a therapist to come in, allowing your doctor to take care of you, following doctor's orders. So you've got some professional support on hand, and then also community support. So there is an author called, also doctor and researcher, all the things, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And that talks about our body's response to trauma. And it's a very scientific, heady book, but at the same time, incredibly validating. And he says social support is the number one thing that separates somebody in a traumatic situation from being further traumatized or from healing. And that's social support is the thing. And he says, what is social support? That is reciprocity. That is where I say, like, okay, I'm grieving. This is who I am. And that person's saying, I see you. I hear you. I will hold you. That is reciprocity. And he says that is the number one thing. So social support is not just, that's not just like felt safety, like that is your safeguard.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with trauma and you're dealing with this loss. And not, as we've talked about, not everybody is going to support you in the way that you need. So I encourage people to take from others the support that comes from their strengths. Let's say your mother is terrible at talking at emotions or about emotions, but she is fantastic at making executive decisions. Maybe your mom is the kind of person that's going to help you make choices for your baby's funeral.
Okay.
And then you save that need to talk to somebody, maybe for your sister or your best friend, or maybe it's not even somebody you know, maybe it's that online community member that you met through a support group. and you're going through losses about the same time, maybe that's the person you reach out to and say, like, I have got to talk about my feelings. So it takes some discernment and some trial and error to kind of figure out, where can I get my social support, and who is actually good at supporting me in what ways are
So
they
that
good?
you're not continually disappointed in what they can offer, because they can offer only
Right.
what they can offer. I get that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you, in a sense, that's allowing your social support not to be like, I think sometimes everybody feels like, I have to be all things to this person in order to really support them well. And that's a really setting the stage up for burnout, right? On both parties.
Yeah.
So allowing somebody and encouraging somebody and asking for support from that person's strength and allowing them to operate from that strength is kind of safeguarding both of you, and it kind of safeguarding that relationship a little bit. But support absolutely is the number one thing. I would say also just to remember, pregnancy loss is not just a woman's issue. It is a man's issue as well. And unfortunately, Western society has some very strong teachings on what masculinity looks like. And so for men, I would say that your needs as a human far outweigh your needs to uphold this idea of masculinity. And I unpack that a lot. There's a whole chapter in my book that I would recommend both parties read, both men and women, both partners, to kind of understand where some of these reactions to grief are coming from, to kind of talk about that. So men, you are not alone. If I don't currently have a support group for men, but there is one you can go to. It's Men of M.E.N.D, M.E.N.D, of Mommies Enduring Neonatal Death. So I just want to recap real quick. Being alone, you could feel alone as a woman. You could feel alone in a partnership. You could feel alone as a man. But you are not alone, and you're not alone in feeling alone. There are a lot of us here, though, that are waiting to hold space for you.
And I just want to, that book and that group and all that stuff will be in the show notes. I just want to say that to anybody who might be listening and saying, where can I find that stuff? So this has been just a really rich conversation, and I'm so grateful for you. Before I let you go, I want to just ask you kind of in a different direction.
Okay.
What are you watching or listening to or reading or doing or participating in that is providing some connection with God for you right now?
So as I shared with you, Angie, earlier, I'm kind of in this really weird spiritual space. And I've kind of explained it to other people, like I've had all of the answers in the world before I ever thought to ask the questions. I was raised in a Christian home. I accepted God at 4. I lived a very I went to a Bible college. I have 3 degrees, 2 of which one's in Bible, one's in theology. So I'm very well versed in answers, and not so well versed in actually asking questions. And so I'm kind of at this space where I'm like, okay, I trust God that you have me, and I'm going to go to my trusted people. It's kind of like grief in the sense that I'm not, sharing all of my questions with everybody in the world. I'm going to people that are safe, that are a little bit ahead of me in this process, that I respect and admire and trust, to kind of go with them with these questions, and then also allowing myself to go to God with these questions without feeling like I have to protect him from me. One of the books, and I'm so sorry for keep referring back to my book, but I have a whole chapter on this. Is one chapter on faith, and that is talking about the book of Job. And we often hear the book of Job and our minds immediately go to the Lord has given, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Well, that happens in chapter 2. There's 42 chapters in Job. And I feel like if God had already given us the perfect answer to suffering, and if Job was a perfect sufferer,
why 40 more chapters?
Why 40 more? I mean, if you think about in the Bible itself, that is a significant chunk of real estate. 40 chapters is a lot. If it were meaningless, why would it be in there? And so what I learned and sort of recognized and felt God was saying was like, hey, as you are holding space for other people, guess what? I've got 40 chapters here that's dedicated to nothing more than wrestling with questions, wrestling with faith in the light of suffering.
Yeah.
And so I feel like God is holding space for me to say, I'm not afraid. And the interesting thing is that at the end of Job, Job never actually finds out why he suffered. But God answers Job. And so when I say that, I don't mean God gives Job the answer, but what God does give him is a bigger glimpse of himself. And the crazy thing is that even before Job's situation changed, that glimpse of who God was enough for him to say, I'd heard of you before, but I know you now. And he was at peace. And that happened before anything in his circumstances changed. And God even, God is not necessarily kind and gentle in that whole like revealing of who he is. It's not a coddling experience. And he's even telling Job like, hey, you accused me of wrongdoing. And Job does. Job accuses God of doing wrong. He was not the perfect sufferer. And yet the harshest words that God had were for the people who were so full of answers, they would not wrestle with the questions. And so that's what I'm taking kind of from this time is that I'm hoping I'm holding on to the promise and the hope that there is more for me to see of who God is, and that is going to be sufficient for me. But in the meantime, I have permission to wrestle with the questions.
I appreciate that so much, Rachel, and I respect it so much. I think one of the bravest things we can do is take God our questions. I really, really do. And I wrote that down, what you said. I've heard of you before, but I know you now. I love that. And I needed that reminder today. I think other people I was in Psalm 34:4 just last night. I was studying with a group of friends. And David is saying, I sought the Lord and he answered me. And we were talking about that answer. And it doesn't mean he answered me with what I hoped he would answer me. It means he speaks to me, right? I sought the Lord and he spoke to me, period. And are we brave enough to leave it there and say, what I want most of you is to experience you, is to know you, right? So thank you for that encouragement, because I think that while other things, people's books and podcasts and all that, the good things, all that, here's a podcast, good things, but nothing replaces the moments that we spend just seeking him for ourselves. So thank you so much for being with us today. I really am grateful for your time. I want to go back over this. Rachel's book will be released August 10 is the launch date, and it is called Unexpecting Real Talk in Pregnancy Loss. I have that correct? I want to make sure that I do.
Pregnancy loss.
On pregnancy loss. Okay. Real Talk on Pregnancy Loss. You can find her writings and other things and the beautiful pictures of her family on thelouisnote.com. Anywhere else you would like to send people to find you, follow you?
I'm sorry, I should have sent you all of that information.
Oh, no, that's fine. Oh, no. I'll put it in the show notes. It's good.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So you can find me on Facebook at Rachel Lewis, speaker and author.
Okay.
And if you just go to Facebook, you can pop in at the Lewis Note and it will pull up my page.
Okay.
And also I have my my support group on Facebook as well. That is called Brave Mamas. It is for mothers who have lost a child at any stage in pregnancy or through just having infertility, also bereavement through adoption, foster care, or even adult children. So if you are a bereaved mother in any capacity, you are welcome to our group. And the last place you can find me is on Instagram, and that is Rachel.theLewisNote.
And I will put all of that in the show notes so that wherever people hang out on social media, they can find you. And Rachel, again, thank you so much for your time and for just sharing pieces of you and what you have learned through your journey. Thank you so much for doing that. Appreciate you.
It was my pleasure. Yeah. Thank you.
Until next time, peace. I appreciate Rachel saying there are a lot of complicated feelings around pregnancy loss. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing some of those complicated feelings with us so that we might be strengthened by your journey. Thank you also for the reminder of the beautiful words of Job 42:5, which say, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Thank you so much for listening. I pray that wherever your day takes you, you are walking in the confident knowledge that you are a beloved, cherished child of God. Peace.